Welcome, everyone. We're going to get this webinar started. I want to thank you all so much for participating. I'm Leah Festa, Director of the Prevention Alliance of Tennessee, and we are wrapping up the New Year, New Focus Part 3 today. I want to just go through a couple procedural items before we get started. The chat box on the bottom is for your use, so feel free to type in comments, questions, and as we go along, the presenters will keep an eye on that, and we'll try to address all comments and questions. We also have a hand-raising option in the corner in case the presenter prompts you to raise your hand for any part of the presentation. That's what they're referring to. I wanted to let you know that there will be a survey after this, just a feedback survey, so that we can improve our training resources for you. So please fill those out candidly. And if you need a certificate, make sure you email me. I'll put my email address in the chat box for everyone to see, but it's leah@tncoalition.org. And one quick note about our website, it is down this week and hopefully coming back up next week. We had some hacking situation, and I've gotten a lot of emails about links not working on the website. So while everyone's on the call, I just wanted to mention that the website is down right now, but we're working on getting that back up. Anyways, I'm going to hand this over to Christina Clark, who's going to do a brief review of what we've gone over the past 2 webinars.
Thank you so much, Leah.
Hey, I just wanted to let you, this is Jennifer. I just wanted to let you know it let me log on to the PowerPoint.
It won't?
It did.
Okay. Thank you. Is anyone else having any trouble logging on, or is everyone okay? Make sure to put in the chat, and we'll make sure to get you the help you need. Also, I will go ahead before we get started, make sure everyone mutes their phone. But thank you all so much for being here. If you were part of the first 2, thank you for hanging on. If you're new to Part 3, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad that you could attend this one. You won't be disappointed. The last 2 Thursdays, you've heard my voice and Christina Marino's, and we were talking about the importance of sustainability and generating revenue for your coalitions. Christina is not on today, as many of you know, with coalitions. You have to multitask, and Coffee County has their monthly coalition meeting right now, so she's going to come on in a little bit to join us if there's any questions at the end relevant to the 2 previous weeks of webinars. So just getting started on today's agenda before we move into just a little overview of what Christina and I presented on the last 2 weeks. Of course, a warm welcome from Leah and Pat. I'm going to review the series of webinars and then introduce you to our wonderful presenters for today, Andrea and Bill. And they are going to go over some key themes of research, from defining sustainability, identifying predictors, and assessing and prioritizing, and then finishing up with the role of evaluation. The past 2 Thursdays, you've heard my voice. I don't know what you're going to do without the Christinas in your life after this for Thursdays. But we're, as you know, Leah and us are always here for you in Tennessee if you ever need anything. But for the past 2 webinar series, we've really talked about generating changing your fundraising perspective to generating revenue. And so I'm going to be ad nauseum and talk about the one thing that I've said over and over again, which is that we have to think like a nonprofit business. We might not be always concerned with bottom lines in order to make money, but we are concerned with bottom line so that we can generate and fund the best possible things that create change in our communities, and that's why we are a business with heart. And I think this is perfect for what we're going to be talking about today, about adding that piece of, as you're thinking about sustainability, you're always thinking about the capacity and talking to the people that have always been involved with some of the things you've been doing over and over again in your communities and having that discussion with them. So Bill and Andrea will go into that in more depth. But so for the learning objectives in Part 1, we really talked about using the tool I provided, that Christina and I provided, to talk about what could be leveraged, cut, or you need to generate more revenue for your coalition or nonprofit. Starting to think about looking at your budgets and your implementation plans in a way that would be sustainable from the roots up. So thinking before you even implemented something, the longevity of that project and how you're going to fund it and how you're going to build capacity for it. And then last webinar, really talking about, great, for the things you decided really work and you need to continue fund, or new initiatives that are needed in your community, how can you either realign your budget to support those in a way that will make them sustainable, or generate more revenue in a way of doing, whether it's grant writing or producing a product that can really start supporting the great work you're doing in your communities. And so, as you know, I've talked a lot about evaluation in a very broad way of saying how important data is to defining what works in your community and whether or not you should keep funding it. One of the key, I would say, like taglines was, if it works and you're successful at it, why are you the only one funding it? And so today, Bill and Andrea are going to talk more about that data, more about the capacity building around evaluation, and how that these discussions, I think a lot of times when we talk about evaluation, we think of really smart people doing numbers, and not thinking about it as a capacity building tool as you bring people together to really talk about what works in your community and how that affects sustainability. So I'm going to hand it over to Bill and Andrea, and they're going to introduce themselves and kind of talk about what they're about to do. So I will hand it over to them now.
Okay, well, hello everybody. This is Bill Geary here. I am the founder of Global Evaluation Solutions. We do, obviously, evaluation services. Thanks for that intro. First, I want to speak on behalf of Andrea and I and say that we're really happy to be here and be able to do this. We always love doing webinars and putting good information out for folks. And we have our own webinar series that we do, so this is kind of an easy task for us, and really happy to be talking to folks in Tennessee. I think one of the things that, just to maybe test the hands going up, because we don't have all that stuff memorized, I don't know if anybody on this webinar has been on any of our webinars on coalition evaluation. So maybe if anybody has been, if you could just raise your hand, just so we know. Because 2 months ago we did a webinar on sustainability. So Christy, looks like Christy was. So good news for those of you who have been, like Christy, this is not the same material that we presented before. Some of it is, obviously, because the research around sustainability is what it is. But we do, since this is a new approach to what we were doing before, there's a different tool, and we'll be using that information that we covered before in a slightly different way. So for those of you who don't know who I am, just really quickly, I have been in coalition work for about 17 years. I've been in evaluation work for about 19 years. That's really what the type of evaluation I specialize in, though I have done all kinds of evaluation. I have coordinated 2 different coalitions. Back in the day, as my friends like to say, and spent quite a bit of time working with CADCA as a master trainer at the academy, and eventually left CADCA last year as the Deputy Director of Evaluation and Research. I think it's important also to know that none of this stuff that we're doing would be possible or look the same if it wasn't for my partner, Andrea, so I'm going to let her introduce herself. Some of you may know who she is as well, but go ahead, Andrea.
Hello, everybody. So as Bill said, I'm Andrea De La Flor. I just wanted to give you a little background if for those of you who don't know my name. I started off with CADCA in the Evaluation and Research Department in 2007 as a CSAP Prevention Fellow. And I know that there's been a Prevention Fellow in Tennessee as well as many of the other states over the years. Multiple ones actually in different cohorts, but that is where I got my start after getting my master's degree in psychology, and I stayed with CADCA up until July of this past year, and I left there as the senior manager for evaluation and research, and that's how Bill and I met at CADCA and got to know each other and have now been doing this. So we don't want to spend too much time on that, but I want to tell you a little bit about who we are. Also exciting is as of October 1st, I'm now Coalition Project Director for a coalition in New Hope, Pennsylvania. And so I get to go from, training people and talking about what people need to be doing and should be doing to, okay, now I'm doing it myself, which is exciting and very different and interesting work. So I have that perspective as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Bill so we can get right into the content for today.
Okay, thanks, Andrea, and you'll be hearing more from Andrea later as we walk through the tool. So here we go. I guess the first place to start is what is the research support? On all of our webinars, of course, as evaluators, by definition, right, we're very concerned with the research. So just for your sake, we put the two primary pieces of research that we will be using on this, particularly the second one, the S-stall piece, is a piece that was published and used and promoted by the CDC as a sustainability tool. So we're going to be taking that piece and adapting it, as you will find out very shortly. So let's talk about why we're using the research that we're using. Both of these pieces of research involve community health. They each address specific predictors of sustainability. They each provide a solution for understanding the question, what do we keep and what do we not keep? And of course, they are both scholarly articles. Some key questions that we're going to talk about today. What are some indicators of sustainability according to the research? We're going to cover that first. Then we're going to talk about how that information can help you decide what you might want to be doing. I think the other thing that's important about key question number 2 is, as we'll discuss at the end, all of these questions are also relevant when you're deciding if you want to begin a new strategy, right? And then the third is, how do I help assure that future strategies are sustainable? One other definition thing that I think we need to cover here is sometimes the language can get a little muddy when we're talking about the differences, say, between activities, strategies, programs, things like that. We have framed all of this as part of our presentation in terms of strategies. That is to say, what is the primary thing that you think will change the local condition, right? With the understanding that the activities that you may engage in are all in support of whatever that primary strategy is. So I hope that makes sense to folks. We're going to be using the word strategy to refer to the basic strategies that you're using to make changes to local conditions. And of course, if there are questions as you go through, feel free to raise your hand or to put them in the chat box, and we'll try to address those as we move along. So this should look familiar to everybody here, and we wanted to put this up, this workflow, I guess, to help make decisions, right, that was provided on previous webinars, and focus specifically on one piece of this, and that is the piece that says cut, right? So there's these questions that you ask yourselves, and you have these answers that say no, and then those answers of no go to the stop sign of cut, right? The place that this conversation fits in is in between the no and the cut, okay? So we would put this in the arrow in between the no's and the cuts, because there are some things that we want to be able to think about besides financial things before we get to the cut, and we're going to talk about what some of those are. So to begin with, I think it's important to talk about what are some of the benefits and some of the costs of cutting and why we need to be careful. So the upside of cutting, probably everybody's very familiar with. That's what this webinar series has been about so far, right? Obviously, it makes funds available for other activities and strategies. That was already mentioned today. That making funds available, of course, allows for potentially more effective strategies to be implemented because you now have freed up resources that you can move forward. And then from kind of a process perspective or a community perspective, doing this kind of process where you cut programs that aren't working so that you can move towards more effective programs or strategies demonstrates to partners and to the community that you take your role as a coalition very seriously, right? It shows that you're not going to invest in things that don't work. And so that raises, I think, awareness of the seriousness that the professionalism of your coalition in the community. But just as there are upsides to cutting, there are also downsides, and that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. And so some of the downside of cutting is if you have strategies that people associate with the coalition or that the coalition has used to gain a lot of support, you could have a morale issue that comes up, people wondering why you would be cutting that, and maybe people feeling a little lost if they had invested themselves in that strategy. They may not feel very good about the work that they've been doing anymore. And so there's the potential of losing morale, especially for the folks who have been working on those strategies. There are also partnerships. Some of the partnerships that you have may be embedded in that strategy, right? So you have partners that are sitting at the table primarily because they were interested in the strategy that you told them you needed help with, and now you're going to throw that away. They may have second thoughts about whether they want to continue. And then the last is the possible loss of trust or confidence. Just as we can spin the idea that, yeah, this isn't working, so we got rid of it, we didn't want to throw more good money after bad, it's also true that there might be naysayers in the community who say, look, see, this shows that they don't really know what they're doing because they invested all this time and effort into this strategy, and now the research shows, their evaluation, I should say, shows that it didn't work, and they're just going to throw it away, right? So things can be spun in different ways, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. So when you're thinking about this, it's thinking about how do I know what do I need to consider before I get to that final decision to cut something or not. And so we're going to offer in this webinar, first let's quickly review the research. There's only a few slides on that. Then we're going to talk about, okay, well, now that we've reviewed the research and we know what it is, how do we apply that to our situation? And Andrew's going to talk a little bit about that, and then she's also going to talk a little bit about assessing what your options are and how you do that. So let's start with the research. Using the research that we talked about at the very beginning, this is the list of, I think there's 10, 9, something like that, of indicators that have been correlated with sustainability. And when I say sustainability, this research specifically refers to having strategies that have been institutionalized in the community, right? They're up and running, they've been around for a long time, and now they're able to sustain themselves. So some of these apply to us and some of them don't, because if you're at the position where the strategy is already up and running and you now have some type of evaluation data that says it's not giving you the impact that you wanted to get out of it, some of these indicators don't apply because some of them apply at the very beginning of the process. So for example, what the research has found is that initial funding, right? The amount of initial funding is one of the key indicators that's been correlated with sustainability of the strategy. That obviously isn't going to apply to most of us because we've already received the initial funding and we're up and running. Okay? But some other ones, political fundraising, of course, that helps to institutionalize practices because you are involved in the political element of your community and you have political backers. Diversity of funding, I think, is something that you've already talked about in the webinar series, and that is related to the number of fundraising strategies, right? So you're creating streams of funding, multiple streams of funding, but you're also doing it in various ways. You're not just having, a whole bunch of people donate at one event every year, for example. Do you have community support for the program, and do you have internal organizational support for the program within the coalition? These are also correlates of sustainability. One that we often don't think about is the funder support. That is to say, does the funder provide for you the tools and the resources that you need in order to sustain what it is that you're doing? Right? And what they mean by that, what the research refers to with funder support, is obviously not just money or resources to actually do the work, but it's resources to think about sustainability and they're helping you sustain your efforts, right? They're connecting you with people who can help you sustain what you're doing. And then the last one is an organizational piece that refers to future orientation. So do you have a coalition that is always thinking about 3 years down the road, 4 years down the road, right? This is very similar. I know that you guys have been talking a lot about the overlap between a coalition and thinking of a coalition like a business. It's very much a business kind of thinking process, right? We're not thinking about the next quarter. We're thinking about 5 or 6 quarters down the road. And those companies are run very differently than companies that are just thinking about the short term. So having that long-term orientation is also correlated with sustainability. So while I said some of these apply to where we are and some don't. So let's extract the ones that apply to where we are. And if we do, we're going to find that there are basically 2 categories of indicators that we are concerned with once we get back data that says it's not working and we're deciding whether to cut or not. And so the first one, when we get back to the slide, I wasn't following with my handout, right? So the first is fidelity, right? So we have support and fidelity. So let's talk about support in the community, right? This is the part that we want to think about how much buy-in is there. And these are the key folks that we are interested with buy-in, right? So the coalition, the community, are key partners, and we want to think about the political buy-in that we may have. And as Andrea will talk about a little later, right, that political buy-in can take a couple different forms, right? Like you could have one really powerful political person, but just one in the community who loves it and wants to keep it going, right? Or you could have a broader range of political support in the community. So it's important to distinguish what they are, right? I don't know if anybody's heard of the show ALF. A long time ago, there was a show called ALF that got terrible ratings, but the president of NBC loved the show. So it stayed on, even though nobody liked it. So it's important to know kind of what are the political motivations that are moving forward. So that's support. The other piece we've identified and kind of labeled as what we call fidelity, right? And so fidelity involves 2 different things that come together. The first is, are we implementing the strategy properly? And that's, for those of you who are familiar with, for example, programs in schools and stuff like that, right? Fidelity refers to that exact indicator, right? Are we implementing it the way it's supposed to be implementing? So for that, then, we would think about, even though the data comes back and says it didn't work, maybe we haven't supported it enough as a coalition, right? Maybe we haven't provided enough resources that's needed to make it succeed. Maybe the folks that are trying to help us do it lack the skills or are uncomfortable with the skill sets that are needed to move forward. So there's a miss there on the skills required to make it work. And then one of the key factors in having programs and strategies work, certainly the research is very clear, that technical assistance is a really important piece. So when problems come up, when challenges come up as the strategy is unfolding, is there a resource that can adequately help address those challenges so that adjustments can be made, right? So we're thinking, are we providing enough resources? Are we providing the skills that people need? And are we providing the assistance? And so we would think of all of that in terms of the first piece of fidelity. The other piece of fidelity, though, that's really important and from an evaluator's perspective is, have we actually evaluated it properly, right? So we may have data that says it's not getting us to where we want to go, but how good is our evaluation? Can we trust the fact that those numbers are accurate, that it really isn't getting us where we want to go? So for this, we primarily focused on a few issues, right? First is, do we have really good multiple indicators, right? Because we don't want to throw away a program if there's only one indication that it's not working, right? We want to make sure that we can build a case. And we would do this for everything in evaluation, right? I know Andrea and I, when we are working with coalitions, you always have multiple indicators for anything that you're trying to measure, because one indicator is not enough to decide whether you should do something certainly isn't enough to know if you've been pouring resources into something, should you throw it away. The other piece is the formative and the process evaluation. Are we doing both? And what will become obvious, I guess, as we get to the next piece that Andrea is going to take over in just a second, is right that formative piece, for those of you not familiar with the language. The formative piece is I refer to it as the how many butts and seats thing, right? Like, what's the outcome? How many more people are doing this? How many fewer people are doing this because of what we're doing, right? Are we meeting our 10% decrease in this goal or whatever, right? That's the formative part of the evaluation. The process part of the evaluation is the part that covers the fidelity piece. Do people like it? Do they have the skills necessary? Have there been hiccups that people have not been able to overcome, or they have overcome them? What's the communication process around the strategy when things go right and wrong? We want to make sure that when we get data back that says something isn't or is working, that we can trust that data, right? So with that shout out, I think I'm going to turn it over to Andrea, who's going to talk a little bit about a form that we created that we think will help you begin the conversation using the variables from the research that we just covered. How do you take that information then and apply it to what you're going to need to do at your coalition level and making sure that you want to cut it? So on to Andrea.
Okay, so before I kind of segue into this tool that we created for the webinar, I want to just, I think maybe remind everyone to please mute their phones, and also to see if anyone has any questions related to what Bill just presented, or any thoughts, anything that makes sense, and based on the research and your experience.
We were told we could just randomly pick people, by the way, so Andrea loves doing that.
So I'll just give you a minute. But reminder that if you have any questions or thoughts, ideas as we go through, just type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we will if you raise your hand, we'll just give you a shout out. And if you're on the phone, you can mute it. And if you're not, you can go ahead and chat in the chat box. So I don't see anything yet, and so I'm just going to kind of move on and keep an eye on that. So I was told that you did not yet receive this tool, but you will in an email after the presentation. So hopefully you can all blow up what you're looking at with the presentation today on the screen and be able to see the tool. We have every piece of it on the next few slides. So basically I just wanted to walk through what this tool is all about and the process that we recommend for going through that tool in your community. So the first piece on the tool is the instructions, of course, just sort of speaks to the purpose behind it. We really saw this tool, as Bill said in the beginning of the presentation, as adding some additional context to what Christina provided in her tool around budget line items or strategies that might be on, you could say, the chopping block potentially, because they're either not working, you don't have the data that shows that they're working, or maybe they're budget busters, but for whatever reason, you now have a few things potentially that are being considered for cutting or adapting or just phasing out. And so I'm not going to read this to you out loud. Here's the instructions. But basically what it says is that there are two key sort of sections of the tool. There are four parts, but they go together with basically what Bill was just talking about, right? Those key indicators of support and fidelity. So you'll see in a minute how this tool is going to allow you to assess the level of support and the level of fidelity that's taking place in your community related to whatever is on the chopping block. So here it is, this is the two first sections that relate to understanding the level of support in your community. It might be sort of in the background, right? You've had a conversation with some key people about cutting something, but let's think a little bit more about how popular this is in the community and how well it's supported in terms of funding and also just involvement. So basically just walking you through this, we have strength of support, and Bill talked about some of this. There may be a key champion that is really supportive of this strategy, someone who is very important to the coalition, maybe even someone who championed the strategy to begin with. So these are things to keep in mind. The strategy has additional strong champions, right, that are actually bringing in resources or just general sense of political support for this strategy that's on the chopping block and a commitment that the community members have. And so here you can see we're looking at a scale from 1 to 7, not at all to a great extent. This section 2 is still around the support piece, so now we're looking at the diversity of support, and that covers funding, that covers the investment of different organizations in the coalition. The more organizations that you have, the more organizations you have in the community that are supportive of the strategy, that's something to consider. Community leaders, multiple community leaders are involved, deeply involved with working on the strategy. And also to consider part of sustainability. And I know one of the things that when I was at CADCA, we did have some conversations with coalitions who had been around for 10 years of DFC funding. We spoke to about 20 of them. And one of the key sustainability indicators that we saw in this qualitative research that we did was that the community saw the coalition as a staple in the community, as a go-to group. And basically, people in the community were going to be very concerned if the coalition was going to go away. So there was this big piece on sort of the coalition has been institutionalized in the community as a group that does more than just substance abuse prevention, but is really a convener, is really knowledgeable about the issues in the community, and is frequently called on to support other organizations. And so I think that that's something that we really want to consider. Sometimes, we think about effectiveness and how that's related to the end goals, particularly that go along with our funding, like a reduction in substance abuse or whatever issue that we're addressing. But sometimes certain strategies build capacity and awareness of the issue and the coalition. And I know that's just one piece here in the support tool, but I think it is an important conversation to have. And so at the end of all of this, and I'm going to walk you through a process and talk more about it, but you can see that there's this subscore, which basically means that once these sections are all scored, you're going to add them together. Let me just move on to the next part of the worksheet, which is sections 3 and 4, which really speak to that fidelity piece that Bill said is the second important indicator to consider. So here you're going to see down the line the kinds of things that you're going to want to have a conversation about and put some thought into. Again, we were talking about the difference between the language, talking about programs. I think when we use the term fidelity, it comes out of that sort of program way of thinking. So I'm just asking everyone to sort of think outside the box with this term, because there's a lot of support that we want to make sure as coalitions that we put in place when we actually engage in a certain strategy, right? We need to be able to train people and make sure that they are fully capable of carrying out the roles that we're asking them to carry out. And so that that skills building piece is really important. If we're evaluation, we need to be doing evaluation and making sure that everything that we're putting in place has a purpose and has specific goals and some specific ways that we're measuring, not just in the long term if it's working, but also some of those things that we're going to find are working in the shorter term. because it takes a while to get to some of these long-term outcomes related to the strategies. But again, has the strategy brought in more people, for example? Has it generated more resources? And this may be due to its popularity in the community. Things like that, I think, are also effective because we are trying to build capacity, and capacity has a lot to do with sustainability. So again, you're looking at, have we actually put the right kind of oversight in place? Do we have the right amount of resources, or has that been limited? And maybe that's why it's not working. So these are questions about sort of, do we do our due diligence? And Bill did mention before that this tool could also be used to start to think about, as we're planning something, a certain strategy is on the table that hasn't yet been implemented. These are the kinds of things we should also be thinking about in terms of setting ourselves up for success. And I just wanted to remind everyone that you could use the tool in that way. Again, so giving people assistance. When we get into the evaluation section, which I talked about a little bit, did we put those outcomes, not just long-term outcomes, in place? Are we looking at the capacity pieces, that process piece that Bill was just talking about? And the formative evaluation, of course, did we achieve what we were intending to achieve? But both are important. And then we have multiple measures because one is never enough. And when we say it's not working, are we really certain about that? Are we looking at the background, the research behind why this strategy is how this strategy is intended to be effective, and if there's anything that we need to do to adapt it based on what the research says? And so again, you have a sub-score here. So let me just, now that I've walked you through the tool, which again you're going to receive in an email after this session, I want to just go through the kinds of options, right, that are on the table now that you've had the sort of should we cut it conversation, and a group of people in the coalition have put a couple of things on the chopping block, and now it's time to have some conversation, which we feel that this tool is really going to facilitate with a broader group of people beyond just those initial, let's say, key staff or maybe board members who are really involved in making the budget decisions for the coalition. And so what kinds of options might we have? Are we going to cut it completely, eliminate it? Is this something that we want to maintain? But maybe we want to adapt it as well based on what the tool says. And so I wanted to also then go through, before we sort of have this step-by-step conversation, a couple of other pieces. We have a grid at the bottom of this score sheet. And it's not sort of an end-all, be-all, but we wanted to provide some guidance around, okay, once we've completed this form with some folks in our community, what do the scores mean? And again, you saw that there's 4 sections, but there's a support section, a support piece and a subscore, and then a fidelity subscore. And we kind of split those 4 sections by 2 and 2. So here you see this grid. And this just gives you a sense of what it might mean, or maybe some guidance around possibly what to do if you have low support and low fidelity. We suggest that you may want to be eliminating this, but first it's important to understand why it's low in that fidelity piece and why it's not supported. Low support score and high fidelity score, we feel like you probably want to eliminate it because it doesn't work, but even though you've actually put all of the resources in that fidelity piece in place, and the community doesn't support it. So now you've decided this is not effective, we want to cut it. Then you had a broader conversation, and yes, it turns out that we did do everything, our due diligence on the fidelity, and people still don't support it. So you probably will eliminate that. High support score and low fidelity, you might want to then, of course, improve the fidelity because there is high community support, and this could lead to good partnership, more partnerships, increased capacity, and some of those pieces of sustainability that that we really aren't covering on this webinar, right? The whole being a staple in the community and having key leaders at the table. And then high support score and high fidelity score. This is an interesting one because you kind of want to find out, right? If we already know, we've already determined that this strategy isn't effective in our community, and we are doing everything that we could possibly do around fidelity, but it's still not working. And people really support it, right? We're going to have a conversation with people about, hey, this program isn't effective. We're doing everything we can, but people still support it. What's going on here? And maybe there's something else that we can put in place. Maybe we could phase this out. Or maybe there's something else that we're already doing in addition to this strategy that will be sort of an acceptable, I don't want to say replacement, but an acceptable alternative. Okay, this other piece that we're doing is kind of addressing some of the same things, and people have high support. Maybe some of the same partners are involved. So maybe we'll phase this one out because we still have that other piece. This, again, is just providing some context. The idea behind this whole tool is that there's a lot of conversations that need to be had when something is put on the chopping block. And then it's important to engage your community. And we wanted people to have sort of a research base, because this is based on the research, a tool that we know is related to sustainability in the first place. So with that said, I'm just going to have Bill jump in because he's going to put his evaluator hat on, which he wears all the time anyway. And he's just going to talk a little bit more with that framework around the kinds of conversations that you can expect that go beyond some of what I just said that's included in this grid.
Okay, well, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I know that looking at grids like this can be a little confusing at first. So there's a couple general rules, I think, with my evaluation hat, as she said, on my head, some things that I would think about. First of all, why is the fidelity score what it is, right? Considering that fidelity has two pieces, are we supporting the program enough? Are we evaluating it well enough? I think it's important for us to be able to understand the difference between those, and so that's why we break those up into two different sections on this, because I think it's important to understand, is it a matter of resources, or is it resources geared towards the strategy, or is it a matter of resources that we need to gear towards our evaluation, right? So they become two distinct areas that we want to talk about. The other is, while this table talks about low and high scores, it's obvious that you could have scores that are in the middle, right? And that starts to get really muddy. And this is, so there's a couple things that you need to really understand, and the folks that need to be in the conversation are folks that understand the history of the strategy and the history of the coalition, right? Is there a reason that we started this strategy in the first place? Are those partners that were engaged with us at the very beginning still involved? How much of our reputation is staked on this from an historical perspective, right? Have we generated a lot of media around this? So we may have some questions to answer for the community. So someone who understands kind of the history of the coalition and the strategy. Also important to have at the table people who are currently involved and engaged in the strategy, both at the community level, the coalition level, and then any partners that you're working with. And I think the third type of person that needs to be involved are those folks that are involved in the evaluation, right? Because there's a big difference in my mind. If you told me that you wanted to decrease marijuana 30-day use by 15% over 2 years, and at the end of the first year, we have a 0% difference, that's different than having, for example, a 5% or a 7% difference. Because I may go, well, 5% means we're kind of moving in the right direction, so can we expect, maybe we just overshot on our estimate, right? The other thing that could be happening is you could be having, another reason to cut a program is not that you haven't reached your objective, but it could be having an opposite number, right? You could come across, and I've worked with coalitions that this has happened, right, many times, that you go, geez, 30-day use increased 5%, in the last year while we were doing this. So it's important to think about, okay, so what are the other things going on in the community that maybe we have not accounted for let's assume, and I always assume, that the strategy is a good one, because at the very beginning, there was a reason we chose that strategy, and there were criteria that we had to meet, and one of them was that it's evidence-based, right? And as a coalition, we thought we'd be able to do it well and that it would apply. So did we make a mistake there, or are there things going on in the community that we didn't account for? So no matter how good the strategy is, we still would not have seen the changes that we wanted to see. And so it's just important as an evaluator, these are the kinds of conversations that I would be leading in a coalition that is facing this kind of situation, right? Let's be more careful about this. Let's think about, are there things going on we didn't understand? And then let's think about what's the impact if we let it go. What this allows us to have conversations about beyond should we maintain, adapt, or cut, it also allows us to have strategic conversations about if we are going to adapt or cut, for example, and if there is a high level of community support, we need to be careful about how we're going to frame this cutting, right? We need to be reaching out to partners, and we want to make sure that we're using language that doesn't leave them, making them feel left out of this conversation. We want to include them in that conversation. We want to point out why we're having these conversations right now about the strategy that they may be involved in. And this tool and this grid, I think, helps us structure what those conversations might look like. So that's all I wanted to talk about with that. So what Andrea is going to talk about next is kind of the recommended process, and then we have a few things to close on. So Andrea.
Okay, so I said that I would be walking through, now that you have the tool, what are you going to do with it? This is something that's so important to Bill and I know on our free monthly webinar series that we have, we always provide a tool, and then we think, okay, what are they going to do with it now? And I know I tell Bill, I play the devil's advocate, because I always, sometimes he puts together these really great tools, and then I look at it and I'm thinking, what about, I have a question about this, and what are we going to tell people to do next? So now they have these tools, what are they going to do? So we want you to feel empowered with this tool and the one that Christina gave you, and now you know, what are we going to do next? And so this is what this slide is all about. The assumption is that a team of people that Christina had recommended to complete the tool that she provided you to, such as, and I would think in most cases it's going to be key coalition staff people, board members, people who are involved in the financial aspects of the coalition, and for some of the coalitions out there who have some work groups together or some committees that also regularly review budget in addition to the staff, right? We're imagining that, and I think Christina sort of guided you around the fact that those are the kinds of people that are going to have those initial conversations using the tool that she provided. And so, again, there's that piece at the top of the tool that talks about, is it not working? Is it not effective? Is it not necessary? If not, then, we should really consider cutting it. And so it's at that point now that group has put some of those budget line items or some of those strategies on the chopping block, and you need to get more information, which we've been talking about, right? You need to have these conversations. So we suggest that a work group could be formed to do this if there isn't already a group of people that has been convened around implementing and carrying out that particular strategy or budget line item. And so the kinds of people that you would, of course, want in the work group would be, and Bill talked about this, people who have been involved in the strategy, kind of putting it out there in the first place, some of those key champions that would be very interested in having a conversation around, hey, we're thinking about cutting this, what do you think? Bringing people in who have been a part of actually carrying out the strategy itself, and as Bill mentioned, the evaluator or the evaluation team, if you have one, to be able to speak in a little more detail about the Fidelity stuff. And, you could provide the worksheet that we're walking you through to people ahead of time, convene this group and tell them, hey, these things are on the chopping block. Here's this worksheet. Can you kind of take a look at this and start thinking about some of these things? For example, maybe the evaluator could prepare some things to bring to the meeting. Some of the other folks could have put some thoughts around it before they come to the meeting. And basically the idea of this meeting, would be to give everyone one of these worksheets and ask them to complete it in their own perspective. So you could do that actually ahead of time or in the group while you're all in the room together. And then you want to have a conversation, have everyone talk about their scores for each of the line items in each of the sections and come up with one consensus form. So you'll end up you're going to have everyone fill it out separately, but then in the end, you're going to come up with one consensus form that goes along with each one of the items that are being considered for phase out, elimination, or maybe some kind of an adaptation. And so then that we feel is going to be able to give you some really research-based ways to have these important conversations that we've been talking about, and to then bring additional context to that first group who put these things on the chopping block to begin with. And it's not that they couldn't be part of the conversation as well, just to point out, but if they're not and they don't want to get into that level of conversation, then the idea was that you would bring these forms to those people, and that would then allow them to have a better context and better understanding and of sort of where everyone else is in the community and integrate that into their final decision. So that pretty much covers the way that we thought that you could use both of the tools together. And I know we've covered a lot around sort of the research. We've talked to you about all these different things that you might come up with in the grid and the different kinds of conversations and the people involved. I know one of the things that we wanted to also just point out as evaluation is so important is that you do want to get your evaluator or evaluation committee or some staff people involved in, what kind of data do we have about the particular strategy and whether or not, why it's working or not in terms of fidelity and support, and bring all of that together to be able to make these important decisions. And this tool can be adapted as well. It was developed by us by looking at the research, and if you do want to use this tool in your community and there's something about it that you think is missing or something about the language, feel free to get back to us because we can also help you work to adapt that, and also your evaluator could do that as well. So it's not a tool, but it wasn't vetted, and it's not an evidence tool that has lots of evidence on it. It was adapted with sort of this research framework in mind, and so therefore it can stand to have a few changes if you think that it needs those. And so I just want to go ahead and open the floor again for any questions, since we haven't had any yet, and I know we've provided a lot of information and said a lot of things. And it's not just questions. Any thoughts? I guess really just we'd like to know if people feel like this is useful and if it makes sense. So we'd be happy to just hear some of your voices and see what you're thinking about. Okay, well, Rochelle, thank you for your comment. Rochelle says that it was a great tool, so that's good to hear. Stacy says, after doing the worksheet, can people follow up with their questions with you? Yes, of course. And, I have our information on one of these next slides because we wanted to just sort of say, okay, so what did we do today? We talked about all of these things, and hopefully you all will go out and have these conversations, and definitely feel free to follow up with us at any time. We do provide services around evaluation, and we do trainings and webinars and things like that. But as Bill said, and I mentioned, we also, for those of you who haven't been on it, have our a YouTube channel, and this program, I guess, or initiative that we call Coalition Evaluation, and that is a free webinar series, and the webinars take place every month. And the next one is on Valentine's Day. And so if you're not already receiving, I know we have a lot of people on our list, but if you're not receiving those messages about our webinars, please do send an email to one of us and ask us to put you on the list. So we'll make sure that you will start receiving these. Again, they're free every month. And we're always available anytime to just, we like to know, what do you want to hear? What kind of information do you need? Because we take that information and put it into our webinars. If you have a success story, we're starting to think about how we can engage coalitions, or what we want to engage coalitions in doing so that they can present on some of these webinars. And really anything else. If you're looking for research on a certain initiative, or you just want to talk about the work that you're doing, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yes, as Lee said, we also provide certificates for people who need them, who are working on their prevention specialist certification or any other kind of certification. We can get you a certificate that says that you attended this webinar.
Okay, so I just want to say before Andrea closes up, thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak to all of you. And certainly if you have any questions, please let us know. We are both passionate about what we do. We both think that there's a lot of good information that's out there. It's just sometimes it doesn't trickle down appropriately. And so this whole thing is our attempt to be able to do that for you all. And I just got an email that I wanted to inform folks about. If you were looking for this kind of funding opportunity, the OJJDP, Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, just announced that they have a new grant opportunity for youth mentoring. So if any of you are interested in that, you may want to check out OJJDP's website. And I guess I can end this one before I turn it over to Andrea the same way I always do. I know that coalition work can be a little crazy. So in the words of the Eagles, take it easy. Don't let the sound of your own wheels drive you crazy. Thank you again, and take care, everybody. Hopefully we'll see you all on the 14th.
Yes, take care, everyone.